And then the final step is the application. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. Paul then stood up in verse 22 in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Now what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you." So he's making an assumption based on his observation. He's making an application based on his observation, his assumption, his validation. I can't say that this is completely accurate, but the reality is this is a methodology that Paul employed here. It's not his standard methodology. It's most clearly seen in this particular example, but it's a type of methodology that helps us move into cross-cultural settings, and especially if you're thinking about ministry, observe, identify your assumptions, validate them insofar as it's possible, ask local people, try and get from them ways to understand what you're seeing, and then see if there's an application you can come up. And it never hurts to run the application by local believers, if you have some, or a cultural informant, if you have identified one in your sojourn. So again, I'll ask you to stop the tape and ask yourself, what might you apply? I'll warn you in advance, I'm not going to walk through this with you, because this is an exercise for you to consider. There is no single story behind this incident. There are multiple legitimate stories behind it, but I want you to see how you take a single incident and you make assumptions about it. How can you validate those, and then what type of applications? What might you say to the man in the picture? What might you say to the woman in the picture as a form of application if you were to go on further with this? So how did Paul apply this? He stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus, "Men of Athens, I see in every way you're very religious. Now I'm going to do this." When they heard about this, the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, others said, "We want to hear you again." At that, Paul left the council. A few men became followers of Paul and believed, among them Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, and also a woman named Damaris. Okay, so that's a framework of what Paul applied. What I want to talk about now is a larger cycle of cultural adaptation that we all go through, and this is painted in two different ways, so you'll see them both simultaneously here. When you first arrive in a new setting, there is an initial euphoria. There's almost nothing I love to do more than to arrive in a new setting and either take a train ride or a bus ride or a car ride, as long as I'm not the one who's driving, and just look and just see the countryside, just see the cityscape, just have the chance to observe. And that's called the honeymoon phase. It also is the phase in which you are unconsciously incompetent in your new setting. You don't know how incompetent you are at this point in time. The reality is you don't know enough to know what you don't know. You don't get past this stage in a short-term trip. Usually getting past this stage takes several months of living in a new setting. Stumbling, making mistakes, and beginning to see how those mistakes, beginning to see what you've done as mistakes. Next step. Irritability and hostility. This is the disenchantment phase. This is a phase in which you look around and you say, why can't they do it better? Why can't they do it logically? Why can't they do it like I do it? And here you've reached the stage now typically where you're consciously incompetent. You know that you don't know. You haven't yet gotten past that hump, but at least you know that you don't know what you're doing and how to go about doing it. Or you're beginning to make steps, but you have to think about it. It hasn't become unconscious to you yet, because you have to go through the third stage, gradual adjustment. This is a way of life I talked about when I was in Swaziland. I reached the stage where I knew I had to change or die. And then I began that process of change. And eventually I became consciously competent, but I had to think about it. I couldn't just do it. I had to think about it, because not maintaining eye contact with Swazis was awkward to me. But if I didn't think about it, I would maintain eye contact with them the way I would with an American, and I realized that that was the wrong way to go about communicating with the Swazis when I was there. But that was a phrase of conscious competence. Eventually you reach a stage of unconscious competence. and you're at a stage where you're adapted or you're bicultural and you're reintegrating into life. Perhaps the easiest metaphor is one of learning how to drive in a new country. What are the rules of the road? And how do you follow them? How do you know what they are? When I was in the Philippines a second time, I rode with a man who had been there for 25 years. And I could see that this man knew the dance of traffic. He was just as relaxed as the Filipino drivers. He knew when to push. He knew when others were pushing and to let them go. So I asked him, help me understand, what are the rules of the road here? He said, well, there are two real things you need to keep in mind. Number one, if your bumper is 1 inch in front of somebody else's bumper, you have the right of way. It's whoever bumpers is ahead of the others. Secondly, if you get into an accident, it's the nicer car driver who is at fault. In other words, the driver of the better car. Because you're richer and you can afford to pay for the damages, and the other person cannot afford as easily as you can. So if you have a very nice car and you run into someone and they have a poor car, actually, if they run into you, it is your fault. I thought, okay, I don't like that rule, but I'm not the owner of this country. I'm not in control in this situation. But if I were to begin to drive in Manila, I would have to learn that dance, just as in Kenya and Swaziland, I learned how to drive on the other side of the road. I bought a truck 3 days into my sojourn in Swaziland, and we drove with someone who had been there a year. We drove to Johannesburg. We bought 3 or 4 trucks, and we all drove in a caravan file. And at the very beginning, at least I was consciously incompetent. It was scary to drive in an urban setting for the first time on the wrong side of the road. Imagine a right turn being the turn that's going against traffic instead of a left-hand turn. And so the nice thing was the experienced driver led the rest of us. So at least it was easier to stay in his lane. But one of the things we were taught is more accidents occur after you start to feel comfortable with driving on the other side of the road. Because what you haven't learned in an emergency, if a car is coming straight forward towards you, what direction do you pull? Well, here in the United States, we pull to the right because we're driving on the right side of the road. In Swaziland and in Kenya and in many former UK colonies, you pull to the left because that's where your curb is. If you follow your instinct, if I were to follow my instinct and pull to the right, I pull right into the driver. And if that driver is trying to avoid me, he would be pulling to his left, which is my right, and the two of us would run head on into each other. But I realized I had become used to this when I had a dream shortly before coming home. In my dream, I was driving back at home, and I had a panic moment wondering whether I was on the correct side of the road. Driving down a street I knew, and in my dream I realized, oh, that's right, if the steering wheel is towards the center of the road, then I'm on the correct side of the road. And so I thought, okay, the steering wheel is on this side, therefore I'm driving right. Driving correctly. And I woke up the next morning. When I thought about the dream, I realized I had put the steering wheel in my parents' car on the other side of the car. So actually in my dream, I was still on the wrong side of the road. Now it shows my anxiety about going back and driving, and there were times when I came back when I was on the wrong side of the road, and my wife would scream or otherwise quickly correct me, and I'd get over onto the proper side of the road. But what it told me was I had adapted, because it was so deeply ingrained in me after driving for a couple of years on that side of the road that when I dreamed about how I should drive, oh, this was normal to me. This was right to me. And so this usually takes especially unconscious incompetence in terms of language. Depending on where you go, that's anywhere from 2 to 10 years before you reach that stage. If you add in all the rest of the items that we've talked about in this course, cultural competence, you're talking usually 5 to 20 years before you reach that stage where you're not even conscious about it and you're yet fully competent. I remember when my parents came to visit us in Kenya, all the questions they asked about all the things that I took for granted, because life in Kenya was normal for me. life in Kenya was very abnormal for them, and it reminded me how far I'd gone. I realized I was at a stage at that point in time, about 5 years into Kenya, of being consciously competent, not yet unconsciously